All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. See a couple more people are joining, but we're going to go ahead and get ourselves started with today's webinar. So welcome to the Gender and Justice Training, part one of a series of webinars that will be featured as part of our Organization for the People's Initiative, Together Home. It's really, really great to see so many people that are joining. We're seeing our partners are joining from DA offices and public defender offices and community leaders joining. It's illustrates that there is a big interest in this very issue that we're going to talk about today, which is how can we get more women home? How can we get more women back with their families, out of incarceration and home thriving? So thank you for joining us today. But before I dive into the agenda, I just want to introduce myself briefly. My name is Hillary Blout. I am the founder of the Organization for the People. I'm a former prosecutor, and I believe deeply in second chances. And I also believe deeply in the outsized impact that mothers and women have, and the real need that we are bringing more women and mothers home from prison. So again, thank you so much for being here with me. And as you'll see on the screen, I am joined by this esteemed panel. We'll do a longer intro for everybody as we get into today's webinar, but let me just quickly introduce who's here. We have Dr. Barbara Bloom, who is the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Gender and Justice, really a national expert on the intersection of incarceration and gender. And then next we have Cassie Gazapura, who is a senior staff attorney here at For the People, and comes to this work with over a decade of experience as a lawyer in California, both as a public defender and then also right before joining our organization, working as an attorney at a community-based organization, supporting and serving survivors of domestic violence, survivors of sexual abuse, and so really has a deep, deep understanding of exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And Cassie leads the Women's Initiative here For the People. And then finally, we have Amika Mota, who is the executive director of the Sister Warriors Freedom Coalition, and also a founding board member of For the People and a dear, dear friend. I always talk about how the work we're doing today actually started in a conversation that she and I had on a car ride right when Amika came home from prison. And so very, very, very excited to be here with all of you. And for all of the audience members, this is about to be a very, very great conversation with the experts that we have. So the agenda that we have for today, I want to caveat by saying we're obviously not going to cover every single issue that there is to cover around this topic of gender and justice and incarceration. But what I will say is that today is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to be hosting. We will have other conversations around these topics, and so please stay tuned and follow up with us, and we'll be sure to get information out about the next webinar that we'll be hosting, but you will be able to hear conversations around what reentry should look like versus what it does look like. You will hear from women who have come home here in California through prosecutor-initiated resentencing, and we'll share more data and more research around what we have learned about women and incarceration. So that will be coming. And then at the end of our initiative, Together Home, we'll be culminating with a toolkit. And in this toolkit will be a series of recommendations from experts all across the justice system. You'll hear from, in this toolkit, recommendations from prosecutors that have been doing this work and that recommendations for prosecutors who are not yet doing this work. You'll hear from the defense community about what they want to see and what has been effective from their perspective. And then certainly you'll hear from women who have gone through this process about what they have needed to be seen and able to get their foot in the door to even be considered, and then what they have needed on their reentry journey home. So stay tuned, please, for all of that. For today's agenda, we're going to cover like three kind of areas of gender and justice as it relates to our initiative Together Home. First, you're going to hear from Dr. Bloom, and she's going to talk about data and research, what she has studied for a very long time about what leads women into the justice system, how trauma really impacts decision-making, and what women need, right, for their healing journey. And then next, you're going to hear from Cassie, who's going to talk about prosecutor-initiated resentencing and really how everything that you'll hear from Dr. Bloom should be and can be incorporated into the PIR process, into the evaluation, into the assessments, and how you think about resentencing, how you think about public safety, how you think about bringing women home, and ultimately why bringing women home from prison is actually going to lead us to safer communities. And then finally, we're going to hear from Amika, and she's going to be able to talk with us about her specific journey coming home, and then what she does now around advocating for women who are still left behind and supporting women on their journeys home as well. We're going to close out with Q&A, and so please use the Q&A feature. We're going to be capturing all of your questions, and then at the end, we will be able to answer the questions that have come in for our panelists. So with that, let me do that more robust intro. There's not enough slides to cover all of Dr. Bloom's expertise, but we'll try to give you a summary of Dr. Bloom. Dr. Bloom is a professor at Sonoma State University. She received her doctorate in sociology from UC Riverside. She has authored so many different journals and reports, and we had an opportunity to really get close and intimate with her research in preparing for today. But so many different chapters in books and reports. She's got over 30 years of experience on this topic and has been serving criminal justice agencies for decades, ranging from prosecutors and judges to the National Institute of Corrections, working directly with different correction agencies from Virginia into Hawaii, here in California, working with sheriffs. She has presented all over the country on these topics at, as you can see here, some very esteemed entities that put conferences and conventions together on these topics. She is the past president of the Western Society of Criminology and has received a number of awards during her time leading these conversations and really being an expert on this intersection, this very complicated intersection of what it means between gender and incarceration. So without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Bloom to our webinar, and I will turn it over to you, Dr. Bloom, to kick us off with the first segment of our webinar.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you to For the People for inviting me to join you in the important work you're doing in the Together Home initiative and for ensuring that incarcerated women are not overlooked in the resentencing project. And so let's start by looking at the data. So even though men continue to take up a greater share of the justice population, there has been a rise in women's incarceration for the past 4 decades. And as you can see, there's been a 525% increase in the incarceration of women, which is nearly double that of men. And when people ask about what are the factors that may have contributed to this increase, you can look at changes in law enforcement practices, changes in sentencing policies and practices, particularly around drug law offenses, and also challenges and barriers to women's reentry that often put them at risk for reincarceration. Next, please. So the US imprisons more women than any other country in the world. 5% of the women in the world are in the US. 30% of incarcerated women in the world are in the US. Across the globe, women are most likely to be in prison for a drug or a property offense. In 2022, the imprisonment rate for Black women was over 1.6 times that of the rate for white women. And for Latinx women, the rate was, excuse me, I have to put on my glasses, 1.3 times the rate for white women. But the rate of incarceration for white women has been increasing, particularly due to drug law offenses. So the women that we are incarcerating represent a very vulnerable population. You see economic disadvantage, families that have experienced domestic violence and addiction problems, minimal education and work experience, histories of substance misuse, physical and mental health problems, high rates of physical and sexual abuse. Over 90% of women report that they have experienced some form of childhood abuse. So, what are the factors? What brings women into the justice system? There's a constellation of issues that impact women and put them at risk for justice system involvement. And many of these issues, they start in childhood and they continue into adulthood. Health problems, mental health problems, trauma, substance use disorder, poverty, housing insecurity. We see these as interrelated factors. They may be different for specific women, but often you see this in terms of the profile of justice-involved women. Trauma is a major issue in women's lives. And trauma is defined as the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. Trauma is actually a normal response to an extreme or an abnormal situation. It can include loss of a loved one, horrific physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. You can witness violence in your family, in your community, or you can directly experience violence in your family or community. You can experience a catastrophic event, a serious health-related event. There are a range of life circumstances that cause trauma. And we see this in the lives of many of our justice-involved women. Violence against women, intimate partner violence, including sexual assault, sexual abuse, human trafficking. These are all defining factors in justice-involved women's lives. Women in the criminal justice system tend to experience high rates of violence. They also experience childhood adversity, and we'll talk more about that shortly. 12% of incarcerated women report homelessness. Prior to age 18, 19% were in the foster care system, This is significant because oftentimes their children end up in the foster care system if there aren't relatives that are able to care for them when the mother goes to prison. 43% of justice-involved women come from families that receive some form of public assistance. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. This was a study that was done in the late 1990s by Kaiser Permanente, Southern California, in concert with the Centers for Disease Control. There were over 17,000 Kaiser members in the San Diego County area who were surveyed about their lives before age 18. And the survey looked at reoccurrent and severe emotional abuse, reoccurrent and severe physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect. Also looked at the environment of the family, growing up in a household where both biological parents were not present. A mother may have been a victim of family violence, an alcoholic or drug-using family member, a mentally ill or institutionalized family member, and finally, a family member that was imprisoned. So this study has had a huge impact on our understanding of the role of adverse childhood experiences and behavior in later life. So after 50 years, we've learned that people have a greater risk of having certain physical diseases and mental illnesses, as well as substance use disorders. There can be a list of chronic health conditions, as you see on this slide. But what we found in a review of over 2,000 studies of ACEs from all over the world, that individuals who've experienced 4 or more ACEs have a higher risk of anxiety, depression. They might engage in substance misuse. They may have alcohol problems. They may have experienced violence, victimization in adulthood, and they may have attempted suicide as an adult. Next, please. So this is a photograph, a PET scan, and we really owe a lot of our knowledge, our emerging knowledge about the effects of trauma on the brain from the field of neuroscience. So the PET scan of a child's brain on the left shows the temporal lobe. And this is a child without significant trauma. But the temporal lobe, which regulates emotion and cognition, is active in a child that has not experienced significant trauma. On the right, you see the temporal lobe activity or lack of activity of a child that has experienced significant trauma. And often this damage to the brain causes emotional dysregulation, the inability to develop relationships, problems with cognition. And so there is more and more emerging science on the role of trauma and brain development. So there have been some studies, one study particularly by my colleague, Dr. Nina Messina, that looked at incarcerated women and adverse childhood experiences. And she found that there was a high prevalence of ACEs amongst incarcerated women compared to men and women in the general population. And as compared to incarcerated men, incarcerated women have a higher prevalence of ACEs. They are definitely 4 or higher. They experienced more pronounced intergenerational impact of those experiences, and they see a greater severity of mental and physical health outcomes. We also know that trauma and mental health are also related with substance use disorders. pathways to substance use and misuse is different for women. Women tend to become addicted more quickly than men. They also tend to use drugs as a coping or self-medication strategy. Women who use drugs also have higher rates of childhood physical and sexual abuse than men. Women in the criminal justice system also experience higher rates of childhood and adult trauma. And trauma history is associated with substance dependence, high-risk behaviors, physical and mental health disorders amongst women in the criminal justice system. Next. Prior to arrest, over a quarter of incarcerated women experience homelessness in the year before their arrest. Over half were unemployed before their arrest, and nearly 60% met the criteria for a substance use disorder prior to arrest. Over 3/4 had some indication of a past or current mental health problem in the year before their arrest. This is all important because if many of these factors have put women at risk for involvement in the justice system, then in order for them to be successful, these factors need to be addressed. So let's zoom in and look at women and violence. As we know, women tend to commit fewer violent offenses than men, but when women do perpetrate violence, it's most often in the context of a relationship. It's someone she knows, a partner, a family member, so it's relational. We also know that histories of layered childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, also can put women at risk for acting out violently. And then there's the issue of intimate partner violence and the role that that plays in women's violent behavior. A colleague of mine, Dr. Elizabeth Leonard, did her doctoral dissertation on convicted survivors, and that's the name of her book if you're interested in reading the narratives of women at the California Institution for Women who were serving sentences for killing their abusive partners. And she dives into their histories and the role that intimate partner violence played in their lives and ultimately the commission of the crime that led them to prison. So how does trauma manifest in the behaviors that lead to women's justice system involvement? It can, as we've learned, impact impulse control, decision-making, aggression, violence, substance use disorders, mental health issues. It can also impact women to get engaged in sex work and also to get involved in criminal behavior before the age of 14. Health issues. Justice-impacted women have backgrounds of inadequate health care and often do not get their health care needs met when they're in prison. Men and women experience disease differently, as we know, and women also do not necessarily get their needed mental health care when they're incarcerated. Many women come to prison, about 5% of women come to prison pregnant, and there's issues around their reproductive care, and in terms of pregnancy, their prenatal care, and then also the issue of the opportunity to perhaps lose their parental rights after their child is born if there is no close relative or person who is able, willing and able to become the caregiver of that child. And then, of course, going back to the issue of gender and abuse, abuse is experienced differently by women. We know that men and women suffer from childhood abuse. Girls and boys tend to be at equal risk from family members and people they know in childhood. As we move towards adolescence, young men are often at risk from people who dislike them. Boys are at greater risk if they are gay, young men of color, gang members, or transitioning. But young women are at risk from lovers or partners, people who are saying, I love you. Moving on into adulthood, men tend to be at greater risk from combat or from being a victim of crime, usually a victim of a crime committed by a stranger. Women are often at risk from someone they love. LGBTQ plus and gender nonconforming people are at the highest risk. So these next two slides show the trajectories from childhood to adulthood for men and then women. For men, the risk continues to decrease with the exception of intimidation. The risk for men being victimized decreases as they reach adulthood over 18 years of age. But for women, we see the trajectories continue from childhood into adulthood on every category: physical, sexual, intimidation, every category of abuse. So we look at the incarceration of women as a gender-specific or gender-responsive experience. And I think it's important to note that in carceral settings, there are a range of potential trauma activators or potential triggers. Receiving a command, an officer yelling a command at a woman, sexual advances or inappropriate comments, accusations and allegations, and then, of course, the use of restraints, body searches, pat searches, the use of isolation, loud noises such as yelling. These are all potential triggers. And these triggers can also elicit a woman to be written up for a rule violation. And women in prison, as we know, and the research has shown this for many years, they're more likely to be written up for rule violations, or in California, we've called them 115s. But the rule violations that women are written up for tend to be what we would call minor. Disobedience, not following an order, disrespect, not acting out violently, but more of a insubordinate violation. Sadly, we also know that sexual abuse and sexual misconduct has been going on in women's prisons for years and years, all across the country. There's been a spotlight more recently on FCI Dublin because of gross sexual abuse by the warden, correctional officers, the chaplain at FCI Dublin. It's been in the news quite a bit, as you all know. And the Prison Rape Elimination Act was really supposed to shine a light on this as one of the aspects of incarceration. But sadly, women are not safe in many US prisons, both federal and state. We also have to look at parental status. A majority of women in prison and in jail are parents of minor children. And many of them were single parents who lived with their parents, with their children prior to incarceration, or they lived in multi-generational households with other family members. About 1.3 million people living in the US today have been separated from their mothers before their 18th birthdays because of their mother's imprisonment. And as I mentioned, about 5% of women are pregnant when they're incarcerated. The issues we have to deal with in terms of parental incarceration is that it's often difficult for caregivers to bring children to visit their mothers in prison. Distance from the facility, lack of resources on the part of caregivers. Some of the caregivers are also taking care of other family members, other grandchildren, for example, if it's a maternal grandmother. And there are also other barriers to visitation. Sometimes mothers are not comfortable having their children come into the environment that is prison, or the caregiver may not be comfortable bringing a child into that environment. And the other issue about this lack of contact between mothers and their children is this puts mothers at risk if their child or children are in the foster care system. Number one, there's no incentive for a foster parent to bring a child to visit his or her mother in prison. But because of the Adoption and Safe Families Act, if a mother has no contact with a child for 15 out of 22 months, at least that was the original legislation, she could lose her parental rights. And that's a whole other discussion. So we say that we think that women in prison are worse off than men. We're not saying that prison is good for men, but for women, it causes more challenges. As I said before, women are more likely than men to be sexually victimized by prison or jail staff. Most prison policies were designed for men. We call them gender neutral. And the environments in these settings are not necessarily safe, and they can trigger traumatic experiences. They can exacerbate trauma-related symptoms, and they can actually diminish a woman's recovery and can result in difficulty adjusting to prison life. And like I said before, access to appropriate physical and mental health care is often inadequate. The other thing that we know is that classification systems were also generally designed for men. They were gender neutral and then applied to women, even though they were not validated on samples of women. But they are used to guide decisions around housing, risk level, readiness for release. And so we tend to support the use of gender responsive classification tools. Misconducts, prison adjustment, and recidivism among women is more closely linked to their intervention needs. In other words, if the needs of women in terms of trauma, mental health, substance use, if those needs are addressed while they're incarcerated, they tend to have better results when they're released, and the chances of them recidivating are less. But repeated exposure to the criminal justice system, in other words, being rearrested and reincarcerated, is also detrimental to women's success. So how do we support women being successful? So we know that overall, women are less violent than men, and they're less likely to reoffend. Women tend to engage in incidents of violence and aggression much less often than men do. When women are released from incarceration, they tend to have lower recidivism rates than men, particularly if their reentry needs are met, which we'll talk about shortly. And for the smaller proportion of women who are incarcerated for violent crimes, when they are released, they do not tend to reoffend with another violent offense. So I'm going to talk about two specific programs. Both of these programs were developed by my colleague and co-director of the Center for Gender and Justice, Dr. Stephanie Covington. And the programs that she has developed and the ones that the research has shown to be effective are gender specific or gender responsive. They recognize the gender differences in the experience of trauma that women experience from childhood into adulthood. They're trauma informed. They're relational. They include creating a safe environment, an environment that's also based on respect, and peer-to-peer programs that promote healthy interactions. They're also multifaceted and holistic. They're not just dealing with cognitive change or quote unquote changing criminal thinking. They work on multiple levels. So Dr. Covington's curriculum, Healing Trauma, it's a short 6-session program, trained facilitators. It's been piloted at both CCWF and CIW. The research results show significant reductions in anger, aggression, hostility, and improvements in social connectedness, emotional regulation, and empathy. The results were most significant for women who had the highest ACE scores. Another curriculum developed by Dr. Covington is Beyond Violence. This program has also been used in both men's and women's prisons. And this is a longer, more detailed session, 20 sessions in total. The study that was done showed positive changes across outcomes around depression, dysregulation, aggression, hostility, recidivism reductions, and it also, importantly, validated the peer-to-peer delivery model, the use of peer facilitators, very important. So we know that women face significant challenges in terms of the reentry process. They face challenges around reunification with their children, finding safe and affordable housing, being able to be economically independent. In other words, to earn a living wage so they can support themselves and their families. And they are really in need of ongoing peer and social support systems. We could have an entire conversation about the importance of reentering a person's community. Reentry really needs to start early on in the incarceration process, and it really needs to be a step-down process, particularly for women who are serving long sentences. So perhaps they can move if they need to into a residential facility where they are receiving programming around mental health, trauma, substance misuse, getting assistance in finding sustainable and supportive housing, including job training and employment, helping with reunification with their children. And so reentry planning is critical for the success of women. And finally, the takeaways. We know that trauma is definitely linked with criminal justice contact for women, and risk of repeat violence is reduced for women when their trauma, mental health, and substance use challenges are addressed. Healing is possible. It doesn't look the same for every woman. Each woman will present with a different constellation of needs. But we know that gender-specific and trauma-informed interventions do work. We have a body of research that supports it. And then lastly, longer sentences can lead to detrimental outcomes for women. They can lead to family disruption, loss of children or connection to children, which makes reentering difficult and reunification difficult. They can relate to community disruption. And so I think it's really important to reconsider these longer sentences and in terms of the whole process of resentencing women in prison. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom. So as we transition into this portion of the training, we're really going to start focusing on connecting the dots between the data and research you just heard from Dr. Bloom and resentencing work under Penal Code Section 1172.1 in California and other PIR statutes. Understanding the context around women's cases is critical, but how does all of this information apply to resentencing work specifically? So before we fully dive in, as a bit of background, there is an emerging recognition amongst policymakers and system stakeholders about the research that you just heard from Dr. Bloom and the connection between trauma, prior victimization, adverse childhood experiences, and criminal justice contact. And we've seen that in sentencing and resentencing or looking back policies that specifically address survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. An example of that is the New York Domestic Violence Survivors Act, passed in 2019. And so some of this policy advocacy is centered around these second chance opportunities and creating new vehicles for prosecutors or courts to reopen sentences in cases where these types of abuse and trauma were present, but perhaps not considered, perhaps not known about, or perhaps not considered in the way that they should have been given what we know now. And then in California, we saw a different approach in Assembly Bill 124, passed in 2021, which is another example of a policy that reflects this emerging understanding. And this bill really focused on expanding affirmative defenses for certain trauma survivors. And it mandated consideration of trauma histories and prior victimization at plea negotiations, at sentencing. And then it also created new post-conviction relief mechanisms for survivors. So it's really this same understanding of the connection between certain types of trauma or prior victimization and contact with the criminal justice system that you see reflected in the language of PIR statutes, including Penal Code Section 1172.1. So under 1172.1 and similar statutes in other states, the court is required to consider factors like prior trauma, both adult and childhood, and specifically names abuse, neglect, sexual trauma. It requires the court to consider a history of intimate partner violence or human trafficking prior to or at the time of the offense, the age of the defendant, whether they were a youth at the time of the commission of the offense, and how any of these present factors contributed to the underlying offense at issue. So I think it's important to remember that while PIR statutes are often broader in their application or their reach and don't necessarily require the presence of these factors, many, including California's, do specifically contemplate the same factors and criteria you see in the policies designed for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, childhood abuse, and these other types of trauma that you see disproportionately that impact women. So the question is, has this statutory language and this recognition of these factors resulted in large numbers of women being resentenced? And the short answer is no. So let's dig into that a little bit. And I should note before I get into these numbers that these are based off of For the People's own work with our district attorney partners and based on our own research. So For the People has directly engaged since around 2018 just under 600 incarcerated persons through our partnerships with various prosecutor offices throughout the country. When we dove into those cases, we found that over 97% of those engagements involved men's cases. And then upon deeper dive and looking into outcomes, we found that since 2018, through our work and more broadly, we are aware of fewer than 3 women whose cases were successfully resentenced under PIR statutes outside of our Together Home initiative. So while it is true that this is partially due to the fact that there are simply fewer incarcerated women in prisons than there are men, this ratio does not fully account for the lack of representation that we have seen of women's cases in the PIR process. So alongside our prosecutor partners, we started to get curious about why PIR work was playing out this way. And here's what we learned. First, while women were not intentionally screened out by partners' initial criteria, neutral factors, things like time served requirements, screening out more serious offenses, screening based on risk levels, these were inadvertently excluding the vast majority of women's cases, so they simply weren't being looked at all. Why? Because what we found is that women are often serving shorter sentences for less serious offenses, or they're serving really long sentences for what are considered to be more serious or violent offenses. And then we also learned just now from Dr. Bloom that women receive more rule violations than men do, particularly for nonviolent compliance-based infractions, which may be impacting things like classification scores and risk levels. And so women are potentially being screened out on that basis as well. So by screening out these cases on the front end, we were not able to get at the factors that we know are often present in women's cases that might warrant a second look, excuse me. So things like past victimization or intimate partner violence, particularly when they're directly correlated to the underlying offense itself. Multi-co-defendant cases where the charges are really serious, but the woman played a lesser role or isn't the heavy. Cases where women were sentenced as transition-aged youth or significant time was added to their sentence based on juvenile strike priors, even if they had no adult priors at the time of sentencing. And also cases involving significant childhood trauma and abuse or high ACE scores, the things you just heard from Dr. Bloom. We're not able to get at any of these factors because women's cases were being screened out at the front end. So much of For the People's work, our initial work with this Together Home initiative has really been working collaboratively with our partners to deep dive into different jurisdictions' prison data and identify the factors that would allow more women's cases through the door so that we have the opportunity to do this type of deep dive into their cases and learn more. So when given the opportunity to do those deep dives on individual cases, this is what we learned. And again, this is based off of very preliminary data. So I wanted to highlight that before I dive into the statistics. But what we did find is that 57% of women reported significant abuse in their childhood. 64% of the women whose cases we reviewed reported a history of sexual abuse, either as a child or as an adult or both. And most of the abuse took place at the hands of a family member, friend, or a loved one. 69% of the women reported a history of domestic violence, including physical, sexual, or emotional abuse by an intimate partner. And interestingly, 71% of the cases we reviewed involved male co-defendants where women were part of a larger incident or series of incidents. Many of these also involved an intimate partner. Next. And then other factors we found to be present. 76% of the women reported substance use issues that played a role in the underlying offense. 35% were mothers. I think it's interesting to note that this is under the percentage that Dr. Bloom cited for the general population of women in prison, but I think it's because we're diving into more serious cases with longer sentences where women were sentenced potentially very early and very young. So it's transition-aged youth, 18, 19, 20. So this statistic is a little bit lower. 57% of the women reported mental health issues prior to their arrest. And 78% of the women experienced poverty or houselessness. And most of them experienced this in their childhood, and it carried into adulthood or early adulthood. So to contextualize this data, let's run through a case hypothetical of an incarcerated woman. We'll call her Tanya. And she is essentially an aggregate of several cases that our team has worked on through the Together Home initiative. And we changed and blended a number of the details to preserve the women's anonymity. So to start, let's review what we get from a cursory review of Tanya's prison data and her prison records. We see that she's in prison for a string of armed robberies that occurred over a 6-month period. This was a gang case, and you saw that reflected in the enhancements to her sentence. She also had a strike prior from a juvenile adjudication, but she had no adult prior convictions. And this was a case involving multiple male co-defendants. She was the only female, and not the quote unquote heavy. And she received a sentence of over 40 years for these robberies. So then when our team did a deep dive into Tanya's case and into her prison records, we also found that Tanya committed these offenses between the ages of 18 and 19 years of age and was sentenced as a transition-aged youth. She had a rocky start to her prison commit. She accumulated around 15 rule violations in the first 8 years of her incarceration, many for fighting, some for failure to attend work or program, and a handful for substance use. And there were also a number of unsubstantiated references to potential gang involvement during the first 8 years of her incarceration. And then what we started to see with Tanya was this slow and steady path towards rehabilitation over a 5 to 6 year period. She started programming and pursuing her education. She started with earning her GED, then started attending some college classes. And during the same period, her rule violations started to slow. They became less violence or fighting based. References to potential gang involvement dissipated from her records entirely. And all of this culminated with her final compliance-based rule violation about 5 years ago. And so what we saw in her prison records over the last 5 years from the time that we reviewed her case was that her prison records reflected significant positive progress. She became deeply involved in prison programs. She started serving as the facilitator in programs that she'd been participating in for a number of years. We saw a steady reduction in her classification score, and she started to receive laudatory chronos from officers who were recognizing her progress. So from here, our team decided we were going to engage with our partners in a deep dive of Tanya's case. And all of the information that we learned from this point on was not included in her prison records at all. So we learned that while in prison, through speaking to Tanya and her family and reviewing her support documents, that she had recently earned her bachelor's degree and was focused on pursuing a master's, that she had just been appointed to a highly competitive leadership role within CDCR that required an extensive application and interview process. She founded a youth violence prevention program in custody. And also we learned that she had maintained a close connection with her siblings, her nieces and nephews throughout her entire time in prison, all of whom were positive, productive members of the community and served as this loving and stable support network for her. We also learned that from Tanya and her family that she had experienced significant childhood trauma and abuse, most of which was not referenced at all in her prison records. We learned that her father had committed suicide when she was 5 years old, and almost immediately after, her mom relapsed and fell deeply into substance use. Around the same time, they lost their house, and soon after ended up moving into subsidized housing in a heavily gang-impacted neighborhood. And this is where Tanya spent the remainder of her childhood, up through her arrest in the case at issue. We also learned that Tanya was sexually abused by a family member over a period of many years in her childhood. And lastly, we learned that her mother encouraged her gang involvement because the proceeds from drug sales essentially helped keep the lights on for the family. So I think the most important takeaway from Tanya's hypothetical is that some of the factors most important to making a determination about her history, how that impacts her culpability, her capacity for change or rehabilitation, was not necessarily evident in her prison records. At best, it provided a window into her trajectory, but it was only after we did a full deep dive, spoke with her family, received her support documents, that we were able to get a full picture of who she was at the time of the offense, how she ended up system entangled, and also her rehabilitative journey over the past 2 decades. I should also say that there's absolutely no way we or our partners could have made any sort of meaningful assessment about Tanya based on a data snapshot or preliminary prison data. Her case would have been ruled out likely as a violent offense, and the opportunity to review and ultimately safely release a woman back to her community would have been missed. Next. So to recap, here's what we know. First, women's cases have been inadvertently excluded from consideration. Most of these cases are screened out on the front end based on facially neutral criteria like time served, type of offense, risk level. 2, as we heard from Dr. Bloom, social history and context around the offense really matters. And there's this emerging recognition reflected in PIR statutes and other more recent reforms around trauma, particularly childhood trauma, intimate partner violence, and the other types of trauma disproportionately impacting women, and how this trauma directly correlates with a woman's contact with the criminal justice system, and this recognition that it should be considered at the time of sentencing or through looking back policies. Third, and Dr. Bloom spoke to this as well in her takeaways, pathways to rehabilitation are varied for women and not always linear. So we learned that there are these identifiable factors, often leading women into the justice system, that are in fact addressable. So in other words, it's not just bad apples getting into trouble. We also learned that the trauma that women experience, though addressable, is deeply complex and compounded due to repeated or persistent victimization, which means that the rehabilitative process is going to be unique for each of them based on what factors brought them into the system to begin with. So progress is likely going to look different for each woman. Some, perhaps because they've experienced less trauma and or ironically, prison is the most stable environment they've ever been, they're going to hit the ground running. For others, I think of Tanya, their process is going to be gradual. And then for others, it will be a 1 step forward, 2 steps back, because the prison environment is itself inherently so traumatizing, because women bring so many unaddressed needs into the system, and for a host of other reasons. And I think we potentially miss out on a lot of cases if we're looking for a specific formula or linear trajectories, or if we blur trauma response and compliance-based rule violations with conduct that demonstrates things like continued gang involvement, propensity for violence, or a whole lack of engagement in existing or accessible resources. And then finally, and I haven't spoken much to this, but Dr. Bloom touched on it quite a bit, we learned that women are relational. So their underlying offenses, particularly those involving violence, are often connected or tied to their relationships with intimate partners, with family members, with people they know. By the same token, it is often women's relationships that drive or motivate them to change their children, their families, and desire to return to their loved ones. And per Dr. Bloom, the most effective and gender-specific interventions for women include supporting them in developing the tools and opportunities for building healthy pro-social relationships, because these relationships and connections are vital to healing and rehabilitation. So when I think about reviewing prison records with that in mind, I think about how community involvement in prison takes many forms and is reflected in a number of different ways in a person's records. Community involvement could be volunteering, it could be engaging in classes, participating in organizations, or facilitating programs. And I think it's easy to overlook or undervalue the ways in which women build community and what it indicates about their capacity or emerging capacity or interest in developing healthy, pro-social, positive relationships that will facilitate their healing and rehabilitation. So it's with all of this context, through our experience, working with experts like Dr. Bloom, policy leaders like Amika Mota, who you'll hear from in a moment, and in reviewing women's cases with a number of our prosecutor partners throughout California and the country, that we arrived at these key recommendations for those engaging in resentencing work in order to be more inclusive of women's cases. So the first is to consider broadening threshold criteria. We've talked a lot about the fact that a large majority of women's cases have been excluded on the front end. So by casting a wider net at the outset, it opens up the possibility of finding cases like Tanya's that on their face might not look like a PIR case, but upon a deeper dive do in fact warrant a second look and could potentially lead to a woman being safely released back to her community. 2, approach PIR cases with a totality of the circumstances analysis. So even though the justice system is moving a million miles a minute, we have to slow down and consider all of the factors at play. Social history, trauma, and the context around a case are mandated areas of consideration under 1172.1 and under other PIR statutes, because they are critical to understanding the facts of the offense itself and how a woman arrived at the place where she committed this crime, her risk level for reoffending, and how we assess classification scores. Are these mostly compliance-based rule violations rooted in trauma responses, or are they actually reflective of someone's capacity for violence? What interventions are needed to allow for healing and rehabilitation? And did a woman take advantage of those resources to the extent possible while she's been inside? And then even perhaps, depending on the type of case, this trauma history might impact how we weigh the concerns or the needs of a victim. Was this an intimate partner violence case, or a case involving a family member, et cetera? And then even more broadly, this analysis and taking into account trauma histories might impact what a just outcome or a just sentence looks like in a particular case. And then finally, it's important to recognize gender as a factor that merits consideration. Now, we fully recognize that this requires nuance and strategy to ensure that the case assessment process is done equitably across all genders. That said, it's important to remember that the facially neutral criteria that is often applied has unintentionally excluded the vast majority of women's cases. So it's by weaving in what we know about women, what brings them into the criminal justice system, what they need to heal or rehabilitate, and how we evaluate their cases, that we are better able to screen in more women's cases, meaningfully review these cases, better assess rehabilitative journeys and the risk posed to the community, and also ensure that women are set up for success upon release. So it is with that I will turn it back over to Hillary to introduce our final speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassie. And now it is my privilege to introduce our final speaker and presenter for our webinar today. This is coming up next. You're going to be able to hear from Amika Mota, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the executive director of Sister Warriors, a founding board member here at For the People, and a good friend. It really was a conversation that Amika and I had many years ago that catalyzed my thinking about the justice system and the impact of the system on women. And I really was spurred to action after that conversation. So hopefully after hearing from her, you will be as well. But let me just tell you just a little bit about Amika. Amika began advocating for women during her time in prison. She was a jailhouse lawyer a paralegal, a firefighter, and then a mentor to several young women that were coming into the justice system while she was there. She was a policy director for the Young Women's Freedom Center, where she led several campaigns, but one of them was to end involuntary servitude in California, which is an ongoing fight now. She has led successful legislative campaigns around how CDCR uses, analyzes, and how the justice system uses and analyzes gang enhancements. And then also the law that we actually talked about and featured here today that has required the courts to consider the trauma histories of those who are being resentenced, and also consider the trauma history in charging and sentencing decisions. She now spearheads the Sister Warriors and has been a policy leader for many, many years, and now is leading the Sister Warriors on a campaign here in California and also nationally. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Amika, to tell us a bit about your story and recommendations that you have for the people that have joined here today.
Thank you so much, Hillary, Barbara, and Cassie. It's an honor to share space with you all and learn from you. And thank you to everyone who is joining to learn more about women and incarceration, and those of you that are advocates for justice and true public safety. I want to bring you on a journey that goes a bit beyond the data and the research and the policy that we've been hearing about today, and go behind the prison walls where so many of our brilliant sisters and survivors reside, serving long-term sentences, many of them having exhausted all legal remedies. We hope to challenge preconceptions and encourage decision makers to take a second look at women and the potential of resentencing. I was raised in the Bay Area during the war on drugs, the Reagan era of mass incarceration and what we call Reaganomics. For women, that meant the narrative of being called welfare queens and the criminalization of poverty. I was involved with the underground street economy by 12 years old and pregnant by 15. Violence, addiction, and mental health struggles were intergenerational realities in my family. I was a young mama to 3 kids under the age of 12 when I was incarcerated for harming someone. During my 30s, I spent 7 years in prison, and my kids bounced around between family and friends before they settled in with their grandparents. Although many of us came to prison with differences in class and race, we all shared similar stories of having endured gender-based violence, poverty, addiction, limited access to resources, housing insecurity, and lack of opportunity to mental health supports and healing. When I entered the prison gates in 2008, all of the other identities that I had before, mama, professional, all of the things I'd done just disappeared. And at that time, I became X32168. The prison that I was sent to was a 7-hour drive from where my kids lived. We were extremely overcrowded in the prisons at that time. And the prison that I was sent to was at 176% capacity. And that looked like 32 women to 1 toilet. Our ceilings were leaking in our cells. We had contaminated drinking water at CIW. At that time, even the boiler rooms were full of bunks. We were so overcrowded. Phone calls home were still inaccessible. This was prior to the time of any reforms. And we could pay up to $15 for 15-minute phone calls with our family. And our families footed the bill for those calls. So they're often inaccessible to many folks to stay connected with their families. In-person visits were expensive and they were few and far between for my family, as you heard, around prison geography just kind of being a barrier to many folks being able to visit their loved ones, and also the cost of those visits. Staying connected to our kids and parenting from prison was a real challenge for many of us. Sexual assault and state-sanctioned violence was and is still rampant in the women's prisons, and conditions then and now are still extreme. For the women inside, healing and restoration looked like growing and building together. Our rehabilitation was up to us, and the most impactful programs were those built by us and for us. If a program that we wanted to see didn't exist, the women built them, and we created peer-to-peer structures that were just natural ways of resource sharing and supporting each other. We spent days together in the law library, learning legal language, sharing tips on how to get our kids back when we came home, and reunite with our families. Organizers circled up on the yard to create policy changes and build movement together. We took self-help courses and read books about healing and trauma while navigating extremely oppressive conditions. Our lives and paths were transformed, not as a result of being in prison, but in spite of it. Being accountable to and protecting each other gave us purpose. It was that time inside that led me to an understanding of how many women were serving sentences that were disproportionate to the harm that they had caused, sometimes decades ago, and the mechanisms to measure or acknowledge their change and growth and rehabilitation just didn't exist. When I came home in 2015, the Young Women's Freedom Center was the organization that supported me in my reentry and allowed me the time to grow, stabilize, reunite with my kids, develop professionally, and ultimately became my political home. Community-based organizations and formerly incarcerated women scooped me up and wrapped around me and my family and ensured that my reentry was successful. And Hillary was one of those women. As she mentioned us meeting when I was fresh out of prison, Hillary was one of those people that was alongside me, ensuring my reentry was successful and smooth. And I'm forever grateful for that. In 2017, hundreds of formerly incarcerated women and girls and trans people of all genders came together in Oakland to launch the Sister Warriors Freedom Coalition. We were determined to dive deeper together on how women in particular are criminalized. We improve conditions for ourselves and our loved ones by fighting for and winning policies and system changes that center the needs and experiences of communities most impacted by systems of exploitation, criminalization, and incarceration. We are building a transformative movement that secures justice, opportunity, and self-determination for all of us. Together, we develop our critical consciousness, we build personal and collective power, and we are healing from historical trauma. This is the framework that we use to teach, learn, develop programs, and engage with each other. We are so honored to partner with For the People on the Women's Initiative, Together Home, and want to lift up all of the women that are inside, survivors that are persevering towards healing and justice and that have put in the work to rehabilitate, making all of our communities stronger and safer while doing so. I'd like to close with the words of a judge speaking at a resentencing hearing for one of our sister warriors. This is what he said. As a judge, we wish that we had a crystal ball, that we could see into the future and determine whether or not the person we are sentencing will turn things around or stay on a destructive path. All I had to base the prediction of what she would do was what her history told me, that her crimes were getting worse, more violent, that there was less regard for those around her, and that she was not capable of turning things around at the time I sentenced her. But the beauty of this resentencing hearing is that I was handed a crystal ball. I get to see now what has happened when she took a hold of her life, got accountable, and who she is truly capable of being. PIR is a crystal ball that grants DAs the ability to responsibly harness that power. I appreciate being engaged in this movement with you all and the opportunity to gather and learn and share with you all today. And I will pass it back to Hillary. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much to Dr. Barbara Bloom, to Cassie Gazapura, and to Amika Mota for taking us through that journey of all the aspects that I think are really important to understand about this work that we are embarking on. So we're now going to turn to answering some questions. So I have a couple of those that have come in, and I will just start with you, Dr. Bloom. There's a question about specific resources, and let me also just say to all of the viewers today that we will be sending the PowerPoint, and the recording will be available. We'll also send a link for those of you that don't have it already to our landing page on the Together Home initiative, where you'll also be able to link to some of the resources that have been discussed. And certainly we'll have a link to Dr. Bloom's organization for several of the references that she made through her presentation. But one of the questions that we have is that, are there resources regarding women who are convicted of crimes committed with an abusive intimate partner?
Well, the resources, I think, are those that help them address their trauma and their healing. And also, I think, like when I spoke about Dr. Covington's curricula, women who get engaged with the curricula, they go back to the experiences that they have had, including intimate partner violence, which might also include engaging in crimes with that intimate partner. And so these are issues that are addressed within the context of these programs. Is that answering the question? In other words, they're not necessarily labeled as this type of program, but they are manifest within the curricula of the programming.
Right. I think that does get to the answer. And I would think that maybe for some of the prosecutors that have joined for today's webinar, that would also be a useful resource for them to better understand what's happening in those dynamics. So I will turn to the next question, and this is for
I'm sorry,
Amika.
I might add something to that.
Yes,
if I
please, please.
So I think that there's also a number of resources. I'm thinking of in California, the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, these larger coalitions that are really focused on serving survivors. And there's this increasing awareness among them as well about the things that we talked about today, the interrelationship between system impacted women and the survivors that they're serving and the unsiloing of those things. And so I think there's a lot of resources to be found there in wrapping women who have experienced that type of violence and then reacted violently back. There's a lot there and a lot happening there around policy advocacy and an emerging awareness of the interrelationship between the two. So to the extent that there's state coalitions that exist wherever you're practicing, and then national coalitions as well, I recommend looking into those.
Great. And we'll be sure to add what you just mentioned, Cassie, onto the resource page as well. So then I'm going to turn to Amika. And one of the questions here, what in prison was the most impactful in terms of supporting your specific healing and also preparing you for coming home? We heard a lot from Dr. Bloom about the drivers and what led women into the justice system. And so therefore, where there is evidence of healing, I think there's comfort in making decisions around people coming home. But can you speak a little bit more about that kind of programming and what was the most impactful? Because you've been home for a while now and you're thriving and running organizations and leading others in their reentry journey. So what was it for you that really was the kind of spark to your change?
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. Thanks for that question. I I'm actually thinking of the story you told of Tanya, Cassie, which I and many others can relate to that initial piece of like entry into prison. And just, I want to reiterate how intense it is and how, you know, someone's life has just dramatically changed. And entering prison, it is really difficult when you come in with this sense of hopelessness and um, uh, you know, this idea that we've just been kind of discarded from society, right? And so it is really normal that that people kind of process that anger and all of the emotions in different ways on the yard. And so sometimes it takes you know, some time to acclimate and to get focused and steady on what our own healing looks like. And I have to say that I just return to this kind of the pure peace, right? I got to the point where acting out on the yard was not conducive to my healing, and that was very clear. And it was other people on the yard that were farther along in their own healing than I was that took me under their wing and, you know, encouraged me to start kind of replacing some of the old habits with new healthy habits. And I do have to say, like, I know there's so much reference to program, but there was something about these kind of really simple everyday shifts that we made within ourselves that like sparked our own healing. And one of those was like I would run on the yard. I would run with other women, right? And sometimes we didn't say anything to each other. We weren't sitting in a class checking off boxes about what we were learning, but we were taking on some new practices that actually led to replacing some of our old things with healthy new things. And, you know, if there was a good book that we read, or there was a good curriculum that we had participated in, that was the other thing, is we shared with each other. You know, we didn't keep our healing to ourselves. We did this collectively. And so I think there was many years of just the groundwork being kind of nourished by the people that were around me that were doing their own healing. And then I can definitely say that once I was ready to engage in self-help programs and learning about violence and trauma, that, you know, though the programs that I stepped into there were primarily around substance abuse and healthy relationships. And there was definitely new ideas and things that I was learning, tools that I took home with me. Also, my experience as a firefighter was huge in the sense that it shifted me from being inside just focus on me or the people there to actually being in service in my community. And that just really, it felt a bit like a step down on the way to coming home and socializing with other people and engaging in healthy behavior, but it gave us purpose and value. And so sometimes that is just kind of missing for a lot of us, and we're trying to find that. So I can definitely say that was a very impactful program on me, but first and foremost, it's the people that were farther along that guided me through it.
Thank you for that. This is a question. I guess we can see who wants to jump in on this question. What steps would you suggest for defense attorneys with clients whose cases are in the categories that may be overlooked for PIR to get those cases to prosecutors? So I guess Cassie and I can both kind of jump in. Cassie, go ahead and get us started, and I have some thoughts as well.
Okay. So I think first, I understand that obviously every prosecutor's office has the discretion to decide what cases they are comfortable reviewing and what cases they aren't. I think supporting them with these types of tools and information around why it might be worth diving in to these types of cases, understanding the things that we just heard about from Dr. Bloom and Amika is really vital to understanding why it's worthwhile opening up some of these cases. And then I think demonstrating perhaps through case workup processes, along with the educational piece about what happens if you do this deep dive. You have this case on its face, like Tanya's, that may look like a hard no, and then you dive in and you learn how much is there underneath it. And when you start reviewing these cases in larger numbers, you start to see patterns emerging. You start to see these really serious cases are often multi-co-defendant cases where a woman isn't the heavy, or you start to see a woman was acting in concert with an abusive partner. Things like that that are really not one-offs, they're patterns. And I think that can be really persuasive over time for those offices that may be a little bit more reluctant or hesitant to dive into that space. That's what I have. Hillary, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I think my suggestion would be, I mean, the process of prosecutor initiated resentencing, it's really it's been around for a couple of years, but it's still newer in this vision for something that can be collaborative between the DA's office, the public defenders, and community-based organizations, incarcerated people and their families. It's not really something that has been done before. So I think the first thing would be just a recognition that if there are offices that have never done this, it is an opportunity to really educate about how this is working, who has been resentenced, how that has looked. And then specifically layering onto that, everything that Cassie said and what we've learned today from Dr. Bloom and from Amika around these real, evidence really of urgency, right? That we are paying closer attention to what's happening for women. But also, the other recommendation is that to be forthcoming about everything that is involved in the women's case, right? It's not helpful to, hide the ball or only give some information, but really instead, it's an opportunity to share everything and also contextualize. Yes, there's a number of RVRs, but let's contextualize what was happening at that time. But ultimately, I think one of the things, and this gets into one of the questions that we have here, is that ultimately there is still a balance that has to be struck between public safety, accountability, justice, rehabilitation, redemption, and also where the victim fits in all of this, right? And so that can't be, understated. That is a part of the evaluation process, as to make sure that a resentencing is not going to result in some kind of re-traumatization of the named victim in the case as well. So I think that beginning these conversations with prosecutors, contextualizing, really just leaning into everything that's involved in the case that you are hoping that the DA is going to look at is a really good first step. And we've seen the opposite true, where some of the information is not provided at the outset, and that can kind of unravel and stall things. As Cassie said, she's talked about a real life case, or a fusion of a couple cases where there were, quote, bad facts. But we just leaned into those bad facts, and behind those bad facts were stories and explanations. And there was a willingness to be curious about those bad facts that led to a more fuller story of somebody that could be safely released. So that would be my recommendation. And it dovetails into this question about what are the other considerations to weigh into the analysis of these cases, and how do you balance, right, between what women have experienced and their trauma, and then about the victim's interest and public safety. And what I would say is that it's the same kind of balancing that you're doing on the front end. The only difference here is that you have an opportunity now, as Amika said, that 5, 10, 15 years have gone by. And so you have an opportunity to see how drivers of criminality have been addressed, how rehabilitation has taken shape, the work that women are putting in to their growth and insight and accountability, such that a lot of the concerns, right, at the beginning of the case when a person is being sentenced, may now be addressed because of what you have seen in terms of the rehabilitation and trajectory of change. So it is still a balancing. It is not ignoring victims' perspectives and rights, but there's more information now on the back end than you may have had when you sentenced somebody. And so that would be how we would recommend looking at this is continuing to balance, but really leaning in with curiosity around what's behind some of these facts that you may think are kind of bad facts.
I think,
Yeah,
sorry, I want to say about that. I think it's also important to remember where a lot of these women's cases are being lost in the process. It's at the front end. The vast majority of women's cases are being screened out before we even get to that assessment process. So I think remembering that just because we're broadening criteria doesn't mean that all of these women are necessarily going to be greenlit for resentencing, but just letting those cases through the door so you can get at those facts that Hillary and Amika were offering is how you arrive at a place where you uncover the cases that may not have been obvious on their face. So I think this is a multi-step process, but the first step is really getting the cases through the door so that you can see what's there and make a meaningful assessment.
right.
So that's step one.
Right. And so I have a question kind of following on to that for you, Dr. Bloom. How can a prosecutor or someone that is evaluating a person's programming make the determination about how the programming has addressed the drivers of criminal activity? What are the things that prosecutors and the courts should be looking for?
They should be looking at the process of how women are moving through the trajectories that we talked about, dealing with trauma, being prepared for release in terms of being able to find affordable and safe housing, being able to reunify with their children, indicators of success we should be looking at moving forward. And that also includes mental health assessments. And as we were saying, success looks different for each individual woman. And not every woman gets to the same place at the same time. But, paying attention to what women are doing to improve their outcomes and what resources are offered to them while they're incarcerated. And I don't really think that we pay enough attention to those factors because, as we've been saying, we look more to rule violations and misconducts and sort of backsliding rather than looking at successful meeting of goals and objectives that women have towards success.
So this question is for Amika, and it's a little bit of a two-part question. One is that, Dr. Bloom, you just mentioned being able to look at the taking advantage of programming and meeting goals and objectives, but we also have a real issue, right, across prisons that programming is not available for everybody all the time. I know that certainly there have been improvements, but some women don't have access to the same level of programming in the prisons. So for Amika, the question for you is one, at what age were you able to start making the changes that you described? And then also, what changes have you seen in terms of programming in the prisons now that you've been home? Because I know you've done a lot of advocacy to get those programs in prison, and you talked about oftentimes, and we hear this all the time, that oftentimes it will be an incarcerated person who pushes for a program and creates the program and has to paint the walls and do all the things that create the space. So at what age, when you were inside, did you begin to make these changes? And then what are some of the positive changes that you have seen in terms of programs offered for women here in California?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, for myself, I spent my 30s in prison. And so I, was early 30s when I arrived. And it was about 3 years into my 7-year incarceration when I made that shift. The first 3 years, if you were just to look at my file and the RVRs and what had happened, it would probably display that I was not going to be successful, right? But year 3, things really, really shifted for me. And some of that was figuring out what I didn't want to continue to do on the yard. And again, so many of these like mentors and folks that were in front of me. And I actually do want to say at the time I was incarcerated, programs were very tough to get into. I was on a 3-year wait list to get a job assignment. It was years before sometimes people could get into programs. And I think there's absolutely truth to that today as well, although we have more programs available in the women's prison. Definitely the geographical location of these prisons are tough. And so although you look at a roster of how many prisons or programs are offered at each prison, often people are still today telling us that they've been on waiting lists for months and months and months with not hearing from anyone, right? So I do think that there are a lot of people that hope to program and hope to engage in these things that could transform them and get them into kind of hooked into this positive programming, but it's not accessible to everybody. And so that is absolutely where we see a lot of people just kind of seize their own healing. And I referenced a lot of these people building programs, and I just want to lift up one of my colleagues, Nikki Martinez, who was a co-founder of the Juvenile Offender Committee. She was a juvenile that was sentenced, and a bunch of young people that came together that had been inside for decades, like said, we really want to look at this together. There are people outside that are paying attention to youth offenders, and they just built what they needed to see together. It just didn't exist before. So definitely, I think today there is still an issue of access to those programs, but we do see more and more people coming in. We are also inside now building out our programming on the inside. And Dr. Bloom, it has been like phenomenal to see the work that you've done. We're so familiar with both you and Stephanie Covington's work. It's obviously just spread throughout the women's prisons. But there's absolutely challenges with programming too. We hear often that, the yard is locked down and providers are turned away. And although people are enrolled, it can take a quick second for those programs to be shut down. So I think we're still struggling with the same types of things, although there is some potential and hope around the governor's vision of the California model, that we will have a little bit more access to program and kind of normal communication with folks from the inside and the outside. Oh yeah, hope that was helpful.
Very helpful. One more question for you, Dr. Bloom, is how do we assess, following up on this, how can a prosecutor or a court assess a person's readiness if the institution doesn't have access to programming, lots of wait lists? I mean, this is a question for both of you, for Amika and Dr. Bloom. So, there's obviously people that are ready that haven't received their bachelor's degree and every other thing that we heard about in Tanya's profile. But what are some of the things that prosecutors and courts can look for?
I think that's very difficult. I mean, if access to programs are difficult, if the institution isn't providing any kind of information to prosecutors, I mean, this may sound very simplistic, but I think then there has to be an interview or a series of interviews with the woman herself, a conversation, because she knows best what, as Amika was saying, where she is in her progress. And if that information is not available from the institution, then I believe there needs to be a process set up to talk directly to the woman. And I'm not sure what your responses would be, but
Right. And Amika, maybe you can share just even, that's a great point. And we know that there are work that's being created from communities that are working directly with incarcerated people and also with their families, creating things like social biographies to be able to fill those gaps, right? So if it doesn't come up on a laudatory cron or on a sheet that comes from the prison, again, it's back to that lean in, ask more questions, because if you're really committed to understanding whether a person has been rehabilitated and their readiness, you can ask better questions and you can look new places. So Amika, if you wanted to share just briefly about the power of what we can learn from families, talking directly to incarcerated people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what has been such a joy about doing this collaboration with For the People is I feel that often like we do get to kind of fill in the gaps that papers and charts and C files would not reveal, right? Many of us have lived amongst these people for many years, right? And we understand intimately like what people's journey looks like. We understand what people are doing on the day-to-day to engage in their own healing and rehabilitation. And so, yeah, I mean, we have found that that is actually what we rely on more than anything is being able to talk to people on the inside that are amongst each other, that can tell us what day-to-day looks like, and people recognize that in the people, the people that they're incarcerated with. Like I would say that people that have really done the work naturally kind of take on leadership positions in many ways on the yard. And so there are just kind of these people in prison that are kind of notoriously known in a good way, right? It's like those are the people that have done the work, that are coming to help the young people that are entering the yard do the work themselves. And those are, you will never find those anywhere. You're not going to find those in any charts, right? We definitely have some staff that can speak to that as well. There's definitely some correctional officers or free world staff that also observe people in their healing and rehabilitation and can speak out. That is very helpful as well. But the kind of power of community and being able to identify where people really are, I think is a bit of a puzzle piece that is missing in a lot of ways from the ability to kind of look back if we just have what the prison is saying about somebody or their charts. And so, yeah, it has been just huge for us to learn like who we are going to go to bat for when we're looking at post-conviction relief. And we just know inherently amongst us as a community of incarcerated people, like who's ready. And we are happy to share that with folks. So I absolutely encourage defenders and prosecutors to engage with people that are doing the work inside and that are credible messengers on the inside that have a deep understanding of how things play out on the yard.
Well, I'll add one final thing to that. I think in reviewing records too, where it might not be super apparent or obvious, there's sometimes little clues, that you can that are leads that you can kind of follow up on if you recognize them. So in Tanya's hypo, there were more serious RBRs at the beginning that were violence-based, and you saw that trajectory start to go down over time. That was an indication in reviewing her file to me that something was starting to change, irrespective of the programming history that I saw. Things in her prison record or her C file that were indicating that she was where she was placed as far as housing, she moved to an honor dorm. That was significant to me. She started volunteering and donating to the community fundraisers that were going on. And again, it goes to one of the takeaways that I think we gleaned from Dr. Bloom's presentation about how integral community is and healthy pro-social community building is for women. And so remembering not to discount the signs of that we see, getting curious about it and kind of digging a little bit deeper to learn more.
Right. Another question for Amika. What role do you think that correction officers play, positively or negatively, in reentry? You just mentioned that sometimes staff can be really helpful in kind of answering these kinds of questions around, readiness and what they've seen. And we also know that we've heard about initiatives that are happening. We've heard about the California model. I know you've been to Norway and you've seen the model that it's after. But the training that's happening with correctional officers around lead with their humanity and moving away from the kind of us versus them. Is that helping? Are we moving in the right direction? I mean, obviously we are, but I guess there's a lot of work to do. So I guess I just wouldn't want viewers to think that we can check the box and now everybody's just getting along and all of the headlines that you saw during Barbara Bloom's presentation are irrelevant. So if you can just speak a little bit about helping, hurting, kind of where we're at in terms of those dynamics.
No, I am happy to talk about this. I do want to say, although I said it myself, the California model, I didn't also intend to prop that up as a solution. I do want to say we are at the very beginning of even beginning to talk about kind of normalization. What does that actually look like inside prisons? And I have to say that we have a huge job ahead of us because culture change does not happen when policy change happens, right? Culture change is a long-term something that we're engaging on, right? And so a lot of correctional officers on the inside are very resistant to the ideal of the California model. It's like this is not what we've been taught, and it's not normal to say good morning to everybody. It's not, so there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done with prison staff before I think they are even ready to actually start thinking about the way that they treat incarcerated women in particular differently. And so we're at the beginning. I feel like we're going to see how that plays out. There are increased staff trainings that are specific to gender, and you see a lot more kind of trauma-informed trainings happening with correctional officers. But what I do want to say is that as much as we critique the officers inside, because we are doing that often, because there is a lot of horrific stories around staff abuse inside the women's prisons, we also know the staff that really stand out or that have really committed themselves to other people's healing, right? We will never forget the ones that were good to us on the yard, or that encouraged us to do good things, or asked about our children, or encouraged us to go do something different, right? Like those are the officers that do take that route, really stand out to us and make quite a difference. But I think that it's going to take a lot of time and energy to shift what the culture looks like inside prison currently. And I actually really would say that normalization, in our opinion, looks like a lot more interaction inside and outside with community-based organizations, other formerly incarcerated people and leaders, and not just a staff incarcerated person dynamic, because you cannot remove the dynamic of power that exists in that relationship. And so as much as we talk about normalization, they still hold the keys to our cell, right? So it doesn't matter if they say good morning, if they are the one that has the pen that can write up that RVR that will keep us from going home. So it's a long-term effort, but we're committed to being inside more, to people seeing more interaction, and also formerly incarcerated people that have made it. I think that makes a really big impact for our folks on the inside.
Right. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. The other question we have here, and I'll give this to Cassie, it's about the Women's Initiative, Together Home. We talked a little bit about it at the outset, but the question is, who are the DA offices that are participating? How were they identified? And if you could speak to any of the other partners.
Sure, I'm happy to take that. So I believe that we have 7 counties in California who have signed on officially to the Women's Initiative, and our engagement with those partners looks really different depending on the county. Officially signed on, we have San Diego County, Riverside County, Contra Costa, Los Angeles, Santa Clara County, and Yolo County. And we kind of went first. I think it's important to say that this is the first phase of this initiative. And so we started with the partnerships that we already had, and sort of worked with our partners to identify, like I said, in the presentation, a lot of this work up front has been sort of diving into each jurisdiction's data and figuring out what cases are there that offer a good starting point for us, and then starting to sort of build out our partnerships from there. So we started in California with mostly the California PIR pilot counties that we already had existing relationships with. And then the hope and the intention is to build out from there, both in California and nationally. Is there anything else that I missed, Hillary, that you want to speak to about that?
No. I mean, I think we just, it bears, saying, highlight, underline, exclamation mark, if there's anybody that is listening here today, anybody from a DA's office that wants to join in this partnership, wants to get a look at who is in your prison population, and we can share more about what this has looked like in other counties, and you want support in doing the work that Dr. Bloom and Cassie and Amika have described here, which is this deeper dive, this deeper analysis, the totality of the circumstances, and you don't have resources to do that, please reach out to us. We are available as a resource to support you through that process.
And
So,
I will say too, in the follow-up email, our email is included, our landing page with an inquiry that's set up specifically if you're a prosecutor county to share your information with us, and we will follow up with you directly to further explore a partnership.
And then the last two questions that we have here, I think I can take these. Does anybody have a list of programs available at each facility? It helps to know what is even available. Amika is shaking her head. We will get that together. It's a very good question, so that if this is a facility that has limited resources, that there are other places to look, but we will get that, and we will add that to the resource page that we have as well. The other, as I mentioned earlier, we will conclude these series of webinars and the Together Home initiative with a toolkit that will also have other resources for prosecutors and defense attorneys and community leaders doing this work. The last question is, who would we present this information to? Are there specific people in DA's offices that decide which cases are considered? Several of the offices will have information on their website. You can also contact us about the offices that we have named that are partnering with us in this initiative, but there should be information on DA offices' websites about who the contact person is. It is important to note that it's the prosecutor initiated resentencing is not mandated. This is a discretionary law that some prosecutors are not using, others are using. And so just keep that in mind as well. You might also, if there's no information on the website with a specific person's name, you might be able to call the main office and connect with somebody that is in the conviction integrity unit or conviction review unit. And somebody in that unit might also have more information about who the contact person is. So with that, lots of thank you comments. That's nice. But with that, we don't have any more questions, just a lot of thank yous that are coming in to Dr. Barbara Bloom, to Cassie Gazapura, and to Amika Mota for spending the time with us to both put this information together and then also present it here today. So thank you to everybody that has joined and spent their day, a couple hours with us. MCLE will be available and coming. And so a lot of that information will be coming out to you in an email. And then we also do have a survey, which we also hope that you will take the time to fill out. It's only a couple of minutes, but it will inform what we do in the subsequent training webinars and what gets included in the toolkit. So please participate with us in making sure that what we're putting together and providing is really answering the questions and hitting the mark. So thank you, everybody. We will close out there, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. And we hope to work with everybody who has signed on today, so we can bring more women home. Thank you.